At 39 years old, Kingston James sat at a polished mahogany table that cost more than his first car and felt the precise, calculated dismantling of his life. He was a man who understood numbers, who built his world on the elegant certainty of physics and the delicate architecture of human biology. But the numbers being read aloud in the sterile quiet of the mediation room were a different kind of math, a brutal arithmetic of subtraction. His wife, Lyric, sat opposite him, flanked by a man in a Xenia suit that cost at least $6,000. The man, her lawyer, droned on, his voice a smooth, expensive weapon. Pursuant to the settlement agreement, Ms. James will retain the marital home in Coral Gables, valued at approximately $850,000. Kingston didn't look at the house in his mind. He didn't picture the soaring ceilings or the lanai, where they'd hosted exactly 3 parties, each one a curated performance of a life he was beginning to realize they'd never actually shared. He just saw the number, $850,000. She will also retain the contents of the joint savings and investment accounts, totaling $272,450, the lawyer continued, a flicker of a glance at his notes. $272,450. Kingston had earmarked that money for a clean room expansion in his small rented lab. It was the seed capital for the next phase of his work, the work Lyric had always called his tinkering. The vehicles? A 2023 BMW X5 and a 2022 Mercedes C-Class with a combined Kelley Blue Book value of $95,000 will also be transferred to Ms. James's sole ownership, $95,000. He had bought her the BMW for her birthday just last year. He remembered the way she'd kissed him, a quick, dry press of her lips that was more about the audience of their friends at the dealership than about him. He drove a 2012 Toyota Camry with 187,000 miles on it, a car he'd bought for its reliability, not its status. That car, apparently, he was allowed to keep. He felt his own lawyer, a court-appointed man whose suit probably cost less than Lyric's shoes, shift uncomfortably beside him. They both knew this was a bloodbath. Kingston had agreed to it to make it end, to stop the constant grinding criticism and the palpable disappointment that had become the background radiation of his marriage. The final indignity came at the end. A paralegal brought in a single worn cardboard box containing the few personal effects from his old home office that Lyric's team had deemed his. On top of the box was a thick manila envelope bulging with papers. Lyric looked at it with pure disdain. Her face, which he had once considered the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, was tight with impatience. "Oh, that," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "That's all the junk from your study. Schematics, old notebooks. Take the paperwork. It's junk." She flicked her wrist, a gesture of dismissal that cut him more deeply than the loss of the house. "I wanted the real assets." Kingston looked from her cold, dismissive face to the envelope. He thought about the thousands of hours it represented, the late nights, the failed prototypes, the slow, painstaking process of innovation. Junk. To her, the physical manifestation of his life's passion was just trash to be cleared out. He stood up, his tall frame feeling hollowed out. His deep brown skin, usually warm and vibrant, felt stretched and thin under the harsh fluorescent lights. He picked up the box. The envelope on top felt heavier than the entire weight of the life they had built, and she had just claimed. He didn't say a word. He just nodded to the lawyers, turned his back on the $1.2 million he had just lost, and walked out of the room, carrying a cardboard box filled with junk. He had no idea that Lyric, in her all-consuming greed, had just made the single greatest mistake of her life. Have you ever been so underestimated that it became your greatest weapon? It's a strange and quiet power, one that people don't see until it's far too late. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to turn someone's low expectations into your own high ground. The life Lyric had wanted, the life she had so effectively secured, was built on a foundation of aesthetic perfection and visible wealth. Kingston remembered the day they closed on the Coral Gables house on a sun-drenched Tuesday in May. It wasn't a home to him. It was a statement. An $850,000 statement on Alhambra Circle with towering royal palms and a meticulously manicured lawn that required a $600 a month landscaping service. King, isn't it perfect? Lyric had breathed, spinning in the cavernous, empty living room. Light poured through the arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I can just see it. A huge original piece by that artist from the design district, what's his name? Right over the fireplace, something that costs at least $20,000. We'll have the mayor over for cocktails. Kingston, a thoughtful black man with a mind that saw the world in interlocking systems, had looked at the wiring. The electrical is a bit dated, he'd said, his voice quiet. We'll need to upgrade the panel if I'm going to run the simulators from my home office. That could be a $5,000 job. Lyric had stopped spinning. Her smile faltered. Simulators? Kingston, this is Coral Gables, not a garage. Your work stays in that little rental space you have. This house is for living, for entertaining. The battle lines were drawn before the first box was even unpacked. The house filled up not with shared memories, but with things. A $12,000 restoration hardware cloud sofa, a set of Italian dining chairs that cost $1,800 each, so delicate he was afraid to sit on them. A $4,000 abstract painting that Lyric had bought at a gallery opening, less for the art, and more for the opportunity to be photographed with the artist. Kingston's contribution was a sturdy, comfortable armchair he'd bought for $450 from a local furniture store, which was quickly relegated to the smallest corner of the family room, an island of simple comfort in an ocean of performative luxury. Their life became a series of these performances. He remembered a dinner party they hosted about a year into the marriage. Lyric was radiant in a $2,400 Burberry dress, her hair in elegant twists that had taken 4 hours and $350 at a high-end salon. She moved through the clusters of guests, bankers, real estate developers, surgeons, her laughter bright and tinkling. One of the guests, a surgeon named Dr. Miles, turned to Kingston. Lyric tells me you're an inventor. Anything I'd know? Before Kingston could answer, Lyric glided over, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. Oh, King is always tinkering away in his little workshop, she said, her smile brilliant and utterly dismissive. It's his hobby. It keeps him busy. She then seamlessly changed the subject to their upcoming trip to St. Bart's, a $15,000 vacation he knew they couldn't comfortably afford. Kingston stood there, wearing a simple but well-made $150 shirt, and felt himself shrink. His little workshop was a professional biomedical lab in Coconut Grove where he was on the verge of perfecting a revolutionary cardiovascular stent. The tinkering involved complex fluid dynamics and biocompatible polymer science that was pushing the boundaries of the field. But in Lyric's world, if it didn't have a designer label or a prestigious address, it didn't have value. He was just an accessory, the quiet, vaguely intellectual husband to the fabulous Lyric James. The tension wasn't always so public. More often, it was in the quiet, corrosive moments at the end of the day. He'd come home, his mind still buzzing with a breakthrough in polymer coating, wanting to share the intricate beauty of the solution he'd found. He'd find Lyric scrolling through Instagram, her brow furrowed. Look at this, she'd say, showing him a picture of a friend's new car. Melissa's husband just got her the new Porsche Macan, the S model. It's only, $70,000? We could afford that. Lyric, we just put 20% down on this house, he'd say gently. "And I need to reinvest about 100,000 of the seed funding back into the lab for the next phase of trials." Her face would harden. "Reinvest? Kingston, that money is sitting in our account. It's for us. For our life. Not for some pipe dream that might never pay off. When are you going to get a real job? Something with a corner office and a guaranteed bonus? My friends' husbands? They don't have labs. They're partners at law firms. They're investment bankers." He had no answer for that. How could he explain that the pipe dream in his lab felt more real and substantial to him than the hollow shell of the life they were living in their expensive house? How could he articulate that his work wasn't about a corner office, but about creating something that could save thousands of lives? He had tried early on to explain the science, the potential, the elegant design of his device. Her eyes would glaze over within seconds. The only part that ever registered was when he mentioned potential market value, and even then, it was with an air of impatient skepticism, as if he were a child talking about finding pirate treasure. The facade of their domestic normalcy was a high-gloss veneer over a rotting core, and the cracks were beginning to show. The end began not with a bang, but with a quiet, chilling declaration. It was a Sunday evening in early 2024. Rain lashed against the expensive hurricane-proof windows of their Coral Gables home. Kingston was in his armchair, the $450 one, reading a dense medical journal. Lyric was standing by the window, silhouetted against the stormy dark. She had been silent for nearly an hour. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the bright, socialite tone she usually employed. Kingston put down the journal. "Do what? If this is about the trip to Aspen, we can talk about the budget again." "No," she said, turning to face him. Her face was a pale, hard mask in the dim light. "This, us, this life, it's not enough." He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "Not enough? Lyric, we live in a beautiful home. We have money in the bank. What is missing?" "Ambition," she snapped, the flatness gone, replaced by a familiar, cutting edge. "Real ambition. I look at my friends, at their lives. Their husbands are closing massive deals, getting promoted, showing up in the business section of the Miami Herald. And what are you doing? You're hiding in that dusty lab playing with your little toys. I'm tired of making excuses for you, Kingston. I'm tired of telling people my husband is a biomedical inventor, when what it really means is you have a glorified hobby that barely breaks even." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. He had just secured a major round of second-stage funding from a private equity firm, a fact he'd tried to explain to her. The $270,000 in their joint account was part of that funding, money he had foolishly, trustingly, deposited where she could access it. To her, it wasn't a sign of success. It was just a new pot of money to be spent on validating her status. "It's not a hobby, Lyric," he said, his voice strained. "It's my life's work. The patent is about to be commercialized. This is the critical phase." She laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I've been hearing about the critical phase for 3 years. I'm done waiting. I want a divorce." The word hung in the air, more violent than a shout. The betrayal wasn't just in the demand. It was in the years of simmering contempt that lay beneath it. He had believed her lack of interest was just a difference in personality. He saw now it was a fundamental lack of respect for who he was. The legal process was a masterclass in humiliation. Lyric hired Marcus Thorne, a notorious divorce attorney from a Brickell high-rise, whose reputation was built on leaving the other party with nothing but their shoelaces. His fee was $1,500 an hour. Kingston, his assets now frozen by Lyric's preliminary filings, was assigned a public defender who seemed perpetually overwhelmed. In their first four-way meeting, Thorne laid out their terms. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a list of demands. Ms. James will be taking the house, the cars, and the liquid assets, Thorne stated, as if discussing the weather. They were acquired during the marriage, and her social and emotional support were critical to Mr. James's ability to conduct his, business. He said the word business with a slight, almost imperceptible sneer. My lab equipment, my research, that predates the marriage, Kingston protested, his voice low. Thorne smiled, a thin, predatory expression. Your research, Mr. James, has produced no income to date. According to your own tax returns, your LLC has operated at a net loss for the past 3 years. Its value is, for all intents and purposes, 0. In fact, Ms. James has been subsidizing your venture with her own, with the marital assets. We're being generous by not asking you to reimburse her. It was a brilliant, cruel twisting of the facts. The net loss was a strategic reinvestment of every dollar back into the research. But on paper, Thorne was right. The asset declaration meeting was even worse. It took place in Thorne's conference room, overlooking Biscayne Bay from the 40th floor. Lyric sat there. Meticulously going through bank statements and credit card bills with her lawyer, tagging every expense that could be construed as personal. She listed her $8,000 collection of designer handbags, her $20,000 jewelry collection, the $7,000 Peloton bike. When it was Kingston's turn, he listed the contents of his lab. A Zeiss microscope. Purchased used, current value approximately $4,000. One Class II biosafety cabinet, $8,000. Assorted glassware and centrifuges, maybe $5,000. Lyric actually let out a small, derisive laugh. She leaned over to Thorne and whispered something that made him smirk. Kingston felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up his neck. He, a black man who had pulled himself up through sheer intellect and relentless hard work, was being mocked by the woman he had loved, reduced to a balance sheet that she found pathetic. He saw his entire life with her in that moment. Every dismissive comment, every glazed-over expression when he tried to share his passion, every demand for a new luxury item to fill the void in their lives. It had never been about partnership. It had been about her perception of his utility. And when his utility didn't translate into a corner office and a German sports car fast enough, he was discarded. The final mediation was a formality. He agreed to everything. He was exhausted. He just wanted out. He wanted the quiet of his own thoughts back, free from the constant hum of her disapproval. He signed the papers, ceding the house, the money, the cars. He signed away the life they were supposed to have built together. That's when she had the paralegal bring in the box. As he stood to leave, Lyric delivered the final blow, the one that would echo in his mind for months. "Take the paperwork. It's junk," she said, waving a dismissive hand at the envelope full of his patents and research notes. "I wanted the real assets." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in months. He saw a stranger, a woman so blinded by the glitter of things that she couldn't see the gold right in front of her. He picked up the box and walked away. The weight of his junk, a strange comfort in his hands. He was leaving with almost nothing. But he was also leaving with everything that mattered. She just didn't know it yet. The rain that had started on the night Lyric asked for a divorce seemed to follow Kingston to Coconut Grove. It was a soft, persistent drizzle, tapping against the single window of his new apartment. The place was a small one-bedroom on the second floor of a modest 3-story building, the kind with open-air hallways and a faint scent of salt and hibiscus. The rent was $2,200 a month, a figure that felt both astronomical and pitiful compared to the $6,000 mortgage on the Coral Gables house. For 3 days, he lived in a space defined by its emptiness. A sleeping bag on the floor of the bedroom, a folding chair he'd bought for $20 at a hardware store, and the single cardboard box from his old life. The glass towers of Brickell, where his life had been legally dismantled, were visible in the distance, their glittering facades a monument to a world he no longer belonged to. This cramped apartment, with its beige walls and popcorn ceiling, felt more honest. On the evening of the third day, at 8:17 p.m., he finally sat on the floor, pulled the box toward him, and lifted the lid. There wasn't much inside. A few framed photos he'd have to find a place for. A worn copy of a book his grandfather, a carpenter, had given him. And on top, the thick, slightly battered manila envelope. He ran his thumb over the clasp, the metal cool against his skin. Junk. Lyric's voice echoed in his head, sharp and clear. He took a deep breath, the air in the empty room thick and still, and opened it. The papers inside were not a random collection. They were a history of his entire professional life, meticulously organized. He pulled out the first document. It was thick, bound with a blue ribbon, and bore the imposing seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. United States Patent US 10, 247 XXXB 2. His hands, usually so steady during the delicate work of assembling micro-devices, trembled slightly. He turned to the first page, his eyes scanning past the technical drawings and abstract, landing on the date. Date of patent, June 12, 2018. June 12, 2018. He had met Lyric at a charity gala in the fall of 2019. They were married on August 22, 2020. This document, this foundational pillar of his entire career, predated her presence in his life by more than a year. It was his, and his alone. He felt a wave of something that wasn't quite relief, but a deep, resonant clarity. It was the feeling of a foothold found on a sheer cliff face. He carefully set the patent aside and reached back into the envelope. The next document was a multi-page contract printed on heavy bond paper, with the corporate logo of Medtronic at the top. It was the global licensing and royalty agreement he had finalized just 3 months before Lyric had asked for a divorce. He had tried to tell her about it, to explain its significance, but she had cut him off to complain about the caterer for a party she was planning. He unfolded the document, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He knew what it said, of course. He had negotiated every clause. But seeing it now, in this empty room, in the wreckage of his former life, it felt different. It felt like a lifeline. He turned to Exhibit A, the royalty schedule. His eyes found the numbers. An initial signing payment of $2 million to be dispersed within 90 days of final execution. A tiered royalty stream based on net global sales of any product incorporating patent US 10,247,000 XXX. Tier 1. 5% on the first $100 million in annual sales. Tier 2. 7% on sales from $100 million to $500 million. The agreement included Medtronic's own conservative internal projections. They anticipated annual sales to exceed $200 million within 3 years of launch. His projected annual income starting in about 18 months was a staggering $8 million. He leaned his head back against the wall, the cool plaster a shock to his skin. He closed his eyes. The rain tapped against the glass. $850,000 for the house, $270,000 in savings, $95,000 in cars, a total of $1,215,000. It was a devastating amount of money, but the initial payment from Medtronic alone would be nearly double that. And the annual income was beyond anything Lyric, in her wildest, most materialistic dreams, could have imagined. A single tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a hot path down his temple. It wasn't a tear of sadness or even of joy. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated irony. She had called it junk. She had fought for the glittering cage of their life, for the tangible, depreciating assets she could show off to her friends, and she had handed him the key to an empire without a second glance. He sat there in the quiet dark for a long time, the Medtronic contract resting in his lap. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt a profound, still calmness settle over him. It was the composure of a man who had just been handed back his future. The envelope didn't just hold paper. It held his work, his name, his freedom, and Lyric had given it to him for free. The 2 years that followed were an exercise in strategic silence. Kingston was playing a game no one else knew was in progress. While Lyric was presumably living her best life in the Coral Gables house she had won, Kingston was quietly, methodically rebuilding his, not on a foundation of luxury, but of purpose. He was, in effect, playing dumb, allowing the world, and any lingering connections to Lyric's social circle, to believe he was the broken, financially ruined man the divorce settlement suggested he was. The first royalty payment of $2 million arrived in a newly opened business account at a small private bank 91 days after the divorce was finalized. The notification came via a discreet email. Kingston looked at the number on his screen, a figure with 6 zeros after the 2, and felt the first real sense of security he'd had in years. His first move was not to a luxury car dealership or a high-end realtor. He went to a used car lot and paid $9,000 in cash for a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a few dings on the passenger side door. It was reliable and anonymous, the perfect vehicle for a man who wanted no attention. Next, he furnished his small Coconut Grove condo. He didn't hire a designer. He went to Wayfair.com. He ordered a simple gray $600 sofa, a $300 coffee table, and a sturdy bed frame for $250. He bought his dishes from Target. The entire apartment was furnished for less than the cost of one of Lyric's Chanel handbags. It was sparse, but it was his. There were no objects in it that existed for performance. Everything served a function. The space felt clean, honest, and calm. The bulk of the money went exactly where he had always intended it to go, into his work. He terminated the lease on his old, cramped lab and leased a 5,000-square-foot space in a modern building near the university. He spent nearly $750,000 outfitting it with the best equipment money could buy. A state-of-the-art clean room, advanced imaging microscopes, and custom-built fabrication tools. He then hired 2 of the brightest recent graduates from the University of Miami's biomedical engineering program, 2 young, hungry minds named Sophia and David. He paid them generous salaries far above the market rate and offered them equity in his company, now named James Innovations. His days took on a new, fulfilling rhythm. He would wake at 6 a.m., make coffee in his simple kitchen, and drive his unassuming Honda to the lab. He spent his days not tinkering, but collaborating, leading his small, brilliant team as they refined the manufacturing process for the stent and began development on 2 new related patents. The work was all-consuming and deeply joyful. He was no longer a hobbyist making excuses. He was a founder and CEO building a future. About a year after the divorce, he had an encounter that tested his resolve. He was at a Starbucks on Commodore Plaza, waiting for a simple $4 black coffee, when he heard his name. Kingston? Oh my God, is that you? He turned to see one of Lyric's closest friends, a woman named Brianna, whose husband was a partner at a downtown law firm. She was dressed in what he recognized as a $1,500 Lululemon X Balmain athleisure set, her wrist adorned with a $12,000 Cartier Love bracelet. She held a $1,200 Celine handbag. Her eyes swept over his simple jeans and polo shirt, his modest $89 Timex watch, and the visible wear on his sneakers. Her expression was a perfect, practiced blend of pity and condescension. "Brianna," he said, his voice even and calm. "Good to see you." I heard about everything," she said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Lyric told me. I'm so sorry. It's just awful what happened. Are you getting by okay?" Kingston thought of the multi-million-dollar laboratory he had just come from, of the royalty statements that now arrived quarterly, each one larger than the last as Medtronic's pre-launch orders stacked up. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of his work, the camaraderie with his team, the profound peace of his simple apartment. He smiled a genuine, warm smile. "I'm doing okay," he said. "Keeping busy. The work is good." Her eyes darted around as if she expected him to be embarrassed. "Well, that's brave of you, to keep at it. Listen, if you ever need anything, a recommendation for a job or something, let me know. I'm sure my husband knows people who are hiring." The offer was so outrageously insulting, so steeped in her complete misunderstanding of his reality, that he almost laughed. Instead, he just nodded. "I appreciate that, Brianna. Thank you." He took his coffee and walked out into the Miami sunshine. He wasn't angry. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. They lived in a world of surfaces, of brand names and postcodes. They judged a man's worth by the car he drove and the watch on his wrist. They had no way to measure the value of an idea, the weight of a patent, or the quiet power of a man who knew his own worth, even when the world told him he had none. He got into his old Honda and drove back to his lab, back to the real work. The world Kingston had built in quiet solitude was shattered by the glossy pages of a magazine. It was October the 2026. For 2.5 years, James Innovations had operated in stealth mode, refining its products and filing new patents. The Medtronic licensed stent had been on the market for a year and was an unprecedented success, rapidly becoming the standard of care for a specific type of coronary artery disease. The royalty payments now flowed into Kingston's business accounts in a torrent, a silent digital river of wealth he had yet to touch for any personal luxury. He had been persuaded by his small board of advisors, which included his lawyer and a retired Medtronic executive, that it was time to emerge from the shadows to attract top-tier talent for their next phase of growth. They had agreed to one, and only one, piece of press, a feature in Barron's. The article was released on a Monday. The cover featured a striking photograph of Kingston. He wasn't posed in a boardroom. He was in his lab, holding up one of his new prototypes, his expression one of intense focus and quiet confidence. His deep brown skin seemed to glow under the studio lighting, and his neat, short locks framed a face that was now, at 41, etched with purpose. The headline was explosive. "The Quiet Genius of Coconut Grove: How Kingston James's Premarital Patent Spawned a Billion-Dollar Medical Revolution." The journalist had done their homework. The article laid out the whole story, a narrative Kingston himself had carefully curated with his legal team. It detailed the brilliance of patent US 10,247,000XXX, filed in 2018. It explained the blockbuster licensing deal with Medtronic. It quoted medical experts who hailed the stent as a once-in-a-generation breakthrough. And most critically, it estimated the annual royalty stream flowing to James Innovations at well over $8 million, and projected Kingston's personal net worth to be, conservatively, in the $50 million range, with a trajectory aimed at 9 figures. The strike was not an action Kingston took, but the inevitable reaction the article provoked. In a palatial Coral Gables living room, surrounded by the $12,000 sofa and the $4,000 painting she had won, Lyric James saw the magazine on her marble coffee table. A friend had left it there. She picked it up, her eyes drawn to the handsome, powerful-looking black man on the cover. It took her a full 3 seconds to realize it was Kingston. Her blood ran cold. She read the headline. Then she read it again. Premarital patent. billion-dollar, $50 million range. The words swam before her eyes. The room, which had always felt like the pinnacle of success, suddenly felt like a cage. Her hands shook as she read the article, her mind racing back to the divorce, to the box of junk, to the manila envelope, to her own words echoing in her memory. I wanted the real assets. A primal scream of rage and disbelief built in her chest. She snatched her phone, her fingers fumbling as she stabbed at the number for Marcus Thorne, her divorce lawyer. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth as ever. Lyric, what a pleasant surprise. Did you see it? She shrieked, her voice raw. Barron's, did you see the magazine? There was a pause. Ah, yes. I've been getting some calls this morning. $50 million, she screamed, tears of fury streaming down her face. He's worth $50 million, and you let me walk away with a house and some table scraps. You told me his work was worthless. You told me it was a hobby. You let him keep it. Now, Lyric, Thorne said, his voice losing its customary smoothness, becoming defensive. Based on the financials he provided, which were certified and legal, the business had no value. It was operating at a loss. This is an unforeseeable windfall from a premarital asset. Our hands were tied. Unforeseeable? It's the same patent, the same junk he was working on in the garage. You're a $1, $500 an hour lawyer. Your job is to foresee things. You're going to fix this. You're going to get me my half. You hear me? My half. She was sobbing now, a torrent of greed and regret. 2 weeks later, a courier delivered a thick envelope to Kingston's lab. It was a summons. Lyric, represented by a new, even more aggressive law firm, was suing him. The claim was audacious. She was petitioning the court to set aside the original divorce settlement, alleging fraudulent concealment of assets. She claimed the Medtronic deal was already in the works during the marriage, and that his work was a marital enterprise she had supported emotionally and socially. She was demanding 50% of James' innovations, 50% of all past and future royalties and punitive damages. Kingston read the document, his face impassive. He felt a cold, hard knot of anger in his chest, but his expression remained calm. He had known this day would come. He had prepared for it for 2.5 years. Lyric had fired the first shot in a war she couldn't possibly win. She had just stepped into a trap that he hadn't set, but had meticulously fortified. Kingston didn't panic. Panic was an inefficient emotion, a waste of energy. Instead, he made a phone call. The next morning at 9 a.m., he was sitting in a conference room on the 50th floor of a glass tower in the heart of Brickell, a building that made Marcus Thorne's old office look like a suburban outpost. Across the gleaming 20-foot obsidian desk sat Anita Desai. She was a senior partner at one of the nation's top litigation firms, a woman renowned for her surgically precise legal mind and a billing rate of $2,000 per hour. She had listened without interruption as Kingston explained the situation. Her focus, absolute. Now, Kingston took the original manila envelope, the very one Lyric had tossed aside, and laid its contents on the desk. The objects seemed to absorb the ambient light of the powerful room, taking on the weight of undeniable truth. First, he placed the ribbon-bound patent, US 10,247,000 XXX. The patent, he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. Filed and granted. The date of issue is June 12, 2018. Anita nodded, making a small note on a leather-bound pad. Next, he laid down a certified copy of his marriage certificate. Our marriage date, August 22, 2020, more than 26 months after the patent was granted. He then produced the original Medtronic agreement, the licensing deal, signed in January of 2024. The agreement explicitly and exclusively license patent US 10,247,000XXX. No other intellectual property is included. Finally, he pushed a fourth document across the desk, a copy of the finalized divorce decree. He had a page flagged. This is the marital settlement agreement signed by Lyric, her attorney Marcus Thorne, and myself. He pointed to a specific clause. Article 4, Section B, it states that I retain sole ownership of my business entity, James Innovations LLC, which both parties agree has a present-day valuation of $0, and Ms. James waives any and all future claims to said entity or any intellectual property it may develop or hold. He leaned back in his chair. The evidence sat there on the black desk, a silent, unassailable fortress. Anita Desai spent a full minute reading the clause in the divorce decree. She then looked back at the patent date, then at the marriage certificate. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She looked up and met Kingston's gaze. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and held a glimmer of admiration. "Mr. James," she said, her voice crisp and confident, "in my 20 years of practicing law, I have rarely seen a case this unambiguous. Her claim of fraudulent concealment is meritless. The core asset, the patent, is demonstrably a premarital asset under Florida law. The income it generates, the royalty stream, is therefore your separate property." She picked up the divorce decree. "And this," she said, tapping the paper, "this is an ironclad waiver. She was represented by counsel. She signed it. She specifically waived her right to the very thing she is now trying to claim. Her emotional support does not convert a premarital asset into a marital one." She leaned forward, her expression turning from analytical to strategic. "This isn't a fight, Mr. James. This is a public execution of a frivolous lawsuit. Their only strategy will be to create negative press, to try and shame you into a settlement. We will not allow that. We will file for immediate summary judgment. We will countersue for legal fees. And we will request sanctions against her and her attorneys for filing a bad faith claim." For the first time since receiving the summons, Kingston felt the cold knot in his chest loosen. He had spent years living with the quiet humiliation of Lyric's dismissal. He had endured the pity of her friends and the loneliness of his solitary work. All that time he had held on to this truth, this sequence of dates and documents. He had kept his composure, trusting in the elegant, unassailable logic of the facts. "What do you need from me?" Kingston asked. Anita Desai's smile widened slightly. "Just one thing. During her deposition for the original divorce, did your ex-wife ever state, on the record, her opinion of your work or your research documents?" Kingston's face remained impassive, but a new light entered his eyes. "Yes," he said, "I believe she did." "Excellent," Anita said, closing her notepad. "This will be over before it even begins. She thinks she's coming for your money. What she's actually about to do is pay for your lawyers." The courtroom was cold, the air conditioned to a morgue-like temperature that seemed to leach the warmth from everything. Lyric sat at the plaintiff's table, a vision of defiant wealth in an $8,700 white Armani suit. She looked like a woman who belonged on the winning side, her posture rigid, her chin high. But Kingston could see the frantic tension in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her papers. She was betting everything on this last, desperate gamble. Her new lawyer, a man with silver hair and a booming voice, was in the middle of an impassioned oration. He paced before the judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman in her late 60s named Judge Marion Fields. "Your Honor, this is a case about fundamental fairness," the lawyer thundered, gesturing toward Kingston. "Mr. James cultivated the image of a struggling artist while secretly negotiating a deal worth tens of millions of dollars. His wife, my client, Ms. James, supported him. She hosted the dinner parties. She maintained the home. She created the stable environment that allowed his genius to flourish. This was an economic partnership. To allow him to hide the fruits of that partnership, simply because of a filing date, would be a gross miscarriage of justice. Kingston sat perfectly still beside Anita Desai. He wore a simple, well-tailored navy suit that cost $800, a fraction of what Lyric was wearing. He didn't look at Lyric. He didn't look at her lawyer. He looked straight ahead at the Florida state seal on the wall behind the judge. His face a mask of serene composure. He had replayed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. When the lawyer finished, Judge Fields looked at Anita Desai. "Ms. Desai, your response?" Anita rose, not with a burst of theatrical energy, but with a quiet, deliberate grace. She walked to the lectern carrying a single, slim folder. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the residual bombast of the previous speech. "Opposing counsel speaks of fairness and partnership. We prefer to speak of facts and the law. The plaintiff's entire case rests on the fiction that she was defrauded. We are here to demonstrate with irrefutable evidence that the only thing she was a victim of was her own poor judgment." She didn't raise her voice. She simply presented the evidence, piece by piece, with the cold precision of a surgeon. She placed a certified copy of the patent on the projector. The date, June 12, 2018, filled the screen. Fact: the asset in question, U.S. Patent 10, 247XXX, was granted to my client on this date. She then projected the marriage certificate. Fact: the parties were married on August 22, 2020, over 2 years later. Under Florida Statute 61.075, this patent is incontrovertibly Mr. James's premarital, non-marital property. She then projected the clause from the signed divorce settlement, the one where Lyric explicitly waived all claims. Fact: the plaintiff, with representation from counsel, signed this waiver. She gambled that the tangible assets, the $850,000 house, the cars, the cash, were worth more than my client's junk paperwork. She gambled and she lost. The court is not here to insure parties against their own bad bets. Then came the final devastating blow. "Finally, Your Honor," Anita said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing every ounce of attention in the room. "The plaintiff claims she was a supportive partner in an economic enterprise she believed in. We have evidence that suggests otherwise." She nodded to the clerk. A moment later, an audio file began to play, the sound filling the silent courtroom. It was a recording of Lyric's deposition from the 2024 divorce proceedings. Her voice, sharp and dismissive, echoed off the walls. Audio. "His work? It was a hobby in the garage. He was always tinkering. It never made a dime. Honestly, it was embarrassing." The lawyer then asked a follow-up question. Audio. "And what about the intellectual property, the patents, the research notes?" Then came Lyric's own voice, dripping with the same condescension Kingston remembered so vividly. Audio. "All that paperwork, it's junk. I don't want it. I told him to take it. I wanted the real assets." The audio clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. Kingston slowly turned his head and looked at Lyric for the first time that day. Her face, which had been a mask of confident indignation, had crumbled. The color had drained from it, leaving her skin a pasty, sickly white against the brilliant fabric of her expensive suit. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide with horror and disbelief. She was staring at the speakers as if they had physically attacked her. In that moment, she understood. She had been defeated not by Kingston, not by his lawyer, but by her own words, her own greed, her own spectacular miscalculation. Judge Fields looked down from the bench, her expression one of utter disdain. She looked at Lyric, then at her lawyer. "Is this a joke?" the judge asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "You brought this into my courtroom? You heard this recording and you still filed this suit?" Lyric's lawyer began to stammer. "Your Honor, context is—" "The context," Judge Fields cut him off, her voice like cracking ice, "is that your client made a calculated decision. She took the house, she took the cash, and she dismissed her husband's life's work as junk. The law does not protect you from the consequences of your own arrogance. Motion for summary judgment is granted. This case is dismissed with prejudice. And Ms. Desai," she said, turning her attention to Anita, "I want a motion for sanctions on my desk by 5 o'clock. This is an egregious abuse of the judicial process." She banged her gavel. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Kingston stood up. He adjusted his tie. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Anita Desai. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom, not looking back, the sound of Lyric's choked sob following him into the hallway. The collapse of Lyric's world was not a single, dramatic event, but a cascade of consequences, each one a direct result of her own choices. The swift, brutal justice of the courtroom was only the beginning. The real price of her greed was paid in the months that followed, a slow, humiliating unraveling of the life she had prized above all else. First, the financial walls caved in. The bill from her new, aggressive law firm arrived a week after the disastrous court hearing. It was for $187,500. A few weeks later, Judge Fields' sanctions were announced. Lyric was ordered to pay the entirety of Kingston's legal fees. Anita Desai's bill was a staggering $320,000. Suddenly, Lyric was on the hook for over $500,000 in legal debt, with absolutely nothing to show for it. Her first lawyer, Marcus Thorne, facing a potential malpractice suit and damage to his own reputation, refused to help, citing her failure to disclose the full context of her opinion about Kingston's work. To cover the initial payments, she had to sell the assets she had fought so hard for. The 2023 BMW X5 was the first to go, sold at a loss for $45,000. Next went her jewelry, including a $15,000 diamond necklace Kingston had given her for their first anniversary. She sold it to a pawn shop for a third of its value. It wasn't enough. Second, she lost the ultimate symbol of her victory, the house. The $850,000 Coral Gables home came with a hefty mortgage and property taxes of nearly $20,000 a year. Without Kingston's income, and with her savings depleted by her lifestyle and initial legal retainers, she had been barely keeping up. Now, facing a mountain of new debt, it was impossible. She was forced to put the house on the market. But the story of her failed lawsuit, a juicy piece of gossip involving a tech millionaire and a greedy ex-wife, had spread like wildfire through Miami's elite circles. The house became notorious. It sat on the market for 6 months before she finally sold it in desperation for $790,000, well below its appraised value. After paying off the mortgage, the realtor's commission, and her remaining legal debts, she was left with less than $50,000. Third, her social standing evaporated. The world she had worshipped, the one built on status and appearances, turned its back on her. She was no longer the tragic, wronged divorcee. She was a cautionary tale, a punchline at the very charity galas she used to attend. Her friends, like Brianna, stopped returning her calls. Invitations dried up. Being associated with Lyric was now a social liability. She had traded a man of substance for a life of surfaces. And when her own surface cracked, she found there was nothing underneath. She had to give up her membership at the exclusive Riviera Country Club, a $30,000 a year expense she could no longer justify. The final consequence was the most private and perhaps the most painful. She was forced to move from the sprawling Coral Gables mansion to a small two-bedroom rental apartment in Kendall, a middle-class suburb far from the glitz of her old life. The woman who had sneered at Kingston's little hobby was now living a life far more modest than the one he had quietly built for himself in Coconut Grove. One evening, about 6 months after the court case, Kingston's phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize, but he knew the voice instantly. It was Lyric. Her tone was nothing like the strident, demanding woman from the courtroom or the dismissive wife from his memory. It was small, broken, and shaky. "Kingston? It's me," she began, her voice thick with tears. I know you have no reason to talk to me. I saw an article about the new pediatric wing you're funding at the hospital. That's a good thing." "A really good thing?" She paused, taking a ragged breath. "I was so stupid. I was so wrong. About everything, about you. I didn't see it. I didn't see you. I threw away something real for nothing. For things that don't even matter. I'm so sorry, King. I'm so sorry." Her voice trailed off into quiet, desperate sobs. Kingston listened to the entire message, his face impassive. He stood on the balcony of his beautiful, modern Coconut Grove condo, which he had finally bought, looking out at the calm waters of the bay. He felt a flicker of something. Not pity, not anger, but a distant, detached sadness for the person she had become. He pressed the delete button. He had forgiven her, not for her sake, but for his own. Long ago. But forgiveness and reconciliation were two different things. Her chapter was over. His was just beginning. 2 years later, in the brilliant, healing sunlight of a Miami afternoon, Kingston James stood on a stage at the University of Miami. The campus was lush and green, a garden of growth and possibility. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a comfortable linen shirt and slacks. At 43, the lines of stress on his face had been replaced by lines of contentment. His deep brown skin was luminous, and a sense of quiet, unshakable peace radiated from him. He was here to officially announce the James Innovators Scholarship, a $10 million endowment he had established. It was designed to provide full 4-year scholarships for promising Black and minority students entering the university's biomedical engineering program. "When I was a student," he said, his voice warm and steady, carrying over the crowd of students, faculty, and local leaders, "I had the ideas and I had the drive. But I didn't always have the resources. I remember what it felt like to have a vision that was bigger than your bank account." He smiled, a genuine, easy smile. "This endowment is not about charity. It's an investment. It's an investment in the brilliant minds that will create things we can't yet imagine, that will solve problems we don't yet know we have. It's about ensuring that the next generation of innovators has the support they need to build their own futures." After the speech, he stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by a group of young, eager students. They weren't asking him about his money or his mansion. They were asking him about polymer degradation rates, about navigating the patent process, about his research. A young Black woman with her hair in intricate braids and bright, intelligent eyes asked him a question about fluid dynamics that was so insightful it made him laugh with delight. This was his community. This was his world. This was real. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, casting a spectacular orange and purple glow across the sky, Kingston took a quiet walk along the path at Bayfront Park. He lived nearby now, in a spacious but not ostentatious penthouse condo with a stunning view of the water. It was a home he had bought not for show, but for the serenity it brought him. The walls were filled not with expensive art, but with framed schematics of his most elegant designs and photos of his team, of the scholarship students, of his late grandfather. He didn't have a new partner yet. He was rediscovering himself, enjoying the simple pleasure of his own company. He was learning that intimacy wasn't about filling a void, but about sharing a fullness. He was full. His life was rich with purpose, with meaningful work, and with the quiet joy of giving back. As he walked, watching the sailboats glide across the bay, he thought about the manila envelope. He thought about wealth. He realized in that moment that true wealth is not something that can be taken from you in a divorce settlement. It's not an address in Coral Gables or a German car or a collection of designer clothes. Those are just things, heavy anchors that can drown you if you hold on too tightly. True wealth is creative. It's the ability to build something from nothing but an idea in your head. True wealth is generative. It's the power to create opportunities for others, to plant seeds in a garden you may not see fully bloom. And true wealth is sovereign. It is the profound, unshakable peace that comes from knowing your own worth, a worth that is not determined by the applause of others, but by the integrity of your own work and the quiet whisper of your own conscience. Lyric had taken the house, the cars, and the cash. But she had left him with the one thing that truly mattered, the proof of his own value. The envelope she had called junk wasn't just a patent, it was his declaration of independence. And in the end, that was worth more than all of it. We all face moments where people try to define our worth for us. The real test is whether we listen to them or to the truth we hold in our own hands. Thank you for joining us on Love Beyond Pride. If Kingston's journey resonated with you, subscribe and share this story. Join us next time for another story of resilience, justice, and the true meaning of a wealthy life.